I think the moment when it became clear that there were people like dying in vast numbers to make this tournament happen in Qatar, I think that's the point where like the plug should have been pulled.
You could be the biggest fucking hypocrite on the planet, but your criticism can be 100% valid.
Are we going to have like international media outlets doing like long form exposés over the treatment of black people in the United States?
Welcome to Radius of Reason. I'm Levon with my co-host Andrey.
Hello, hello.
And today we're going to be talking about the World Cup in Qatar. And we're going to discuss the human rights violations, the cultural criticism of Qatar, perhaps even some Western hypocrisy.
A little sprinkle of...
But let's just start off with like a bang. Are the people criticizing Qatar racist?
Against who?
Qataris and Arabs.
Who's doing the criticism?
The Westerners, pretty much.
I think every single Westerner is in their right to criticize Qatar for its treatment of workers and LGBTQ, except the United Kingdom.
Why? Because their teeth are bad, or
no? I mean, I mostly think that the British probably should take a seat on a lot of issues.
Well, hold on. Let's first let's break down exactly like what's happened. Let's kind of summarize that.
Yeah, what happened at this World Cup? Who won? Why did they win?
Well, Messi put in an unbelievable performance.
Unbelievable.
Messi was the real winner, but. No, the 6,000 plus migrant workers perished during the construction of the stadiums and infrastructure specifically for the World Cup. Now, we know that, Qatar has kind of denied this number. They actually claim that only 3 migrant workers died in activities specifically related to World Cup construction.
Right.
Now, The Guardian did an investigation where they found that number was closer to 6,500. Who should we believe, Andrey? Who has the incentive to be biased here against large numbers?
Well, look, I think the number is probably somewhere in between, maybe even far more than 6,000. I think 3 is a little... how do I put it? Generous. I suspect that, any massive infrastructure project that's being built is going to have casualties, and it ain't going to be 3. And I also find that it's interesting that Qatar is debating the 6,500 number by saying that's all the migrants who died, across the entire country. It's well, Christ, man,
that still sucks.
It's not that big of a country.
Well, yeah, specifically, so there's only 300,000 citizens, but 2.9 million people, right? So they had to import a shit ton of people to help them build all this infrastructure specifically for the World Cup. Now, okay, so they basically lied about the migrant deaths. And there's really nothing to debate, right, on that front. That's insanely fucked up. As much as big of a Messi fan, I am, I don't want 6,500 people to die for us to host a sporting event, right? That's just it's really unconscionable, right? Because we know humans are really bad when we start thinking in these big numbers, right? If it was just a child that died, right? A small girl that died during the construction of the World Cup, we would actually show more emotion because we can relate to this one individual. But when you start racking up numbers this big, you get desensitized. But this is an unbelievable tragedy that
right.
occurred.
And what's interesting, I was just kind of looking at numbers here. In the 2014 World Cup in Brazil, they reported, and it was kind of held up by some of the international media outlets, that only 8 people died in the construction of all the construction and refurbishment of the stadiums in Brazil. So I guess this is also a question of why do we take Brazil's claim at face value versus
racism.
Well, could it be race? Could it be how
subconscious racism?
I mean, are we getting? I don't know. I don't know. But I mean, it is this question of okay, Brazil says 8, and everybody's like, yeah, it's 8. But what about Qatar in the Middle East that we just know that 3 isn't the case? And I think when you start playing around with numbers of like how many people died, how many people didn't die, it's kind of just a messed up experiment anyways. There are other things we can also objectively look at to underscore the fact that, things weren't that fantastic in Qatar leading up to the Olympics. I mean, specifically look at the conditions that the migrant workers were living in and continue living in, right? The 6,500 that didn't die, let's say, all the others were during the course of building up all the stadiums, were living in objective squalor, right? There was like a great video report, I think by the NBC, where they had a camera crew in there. And it's like one bathroom for like 80 people or something like that. So basically like slum dorms.
Mm-hmm. And the temperature reaches over 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the summers easily.
Right.
Like
not a great condition to be in. And I think what is uncomfortable here is also that this isn't like a unique thing that happened specifically when Qatar was like rushing to build up its facilities for the World Cup, right? I mean, Christ, like they didn't just build like 4 stadiums. They built an entire new city to accommodate all of the people and the tourism and the businesses that would support and sustain the tournament, right? So like people lived in squalor, workers lived in squalor, and a percentage of them died during the construction, but this isn't like an isolated case study, right? We know that labor rights in Qatar and also in places like the United Arab Emirates are pretty horrific, especially because a lot of workers coming from the Philippines, Bangladesh, India, they arrive to these countries and they get their documents seized and they can't leave, and they get paid really shit wages that they end up sending a percentage over to their families back in the home countries anyways. So I mean, objectively speaking, these are just countries that do exploit labor. And we can get into this a little bit later on in the episode, but is that any different than any other country that's ever held a World Cup, right? And that goes back to the point I was making about Brazil is, yes, okay, all these things may be true, but also, is there something else underlying the criticisms that people issued towards Qatar leading up to the tournament?
Yeah, I think that maybe the issue is it's also coupled with some of these, how do you say, woke issues? Maybe
the first woke World Cup,
LGBT rights, women's rights, Islamophobia.
Right.
When you couple all that in with the migrant deaths, then like there's this just general distrust of Qatar.
And look, I think that, let me ask you this question. If this World Cup in Qatar happened in 2004, do you think there would have been as much scrutiny to their human rights records, right? Like, do you think there is something unique about the moment we're living in with the hyper scrutiny on the rights of LGBTQ plus communities, the hyper scrutiny on the treatment of women, both in workplace and society after the Me Too movement? So do you think if this tournament happened 10, 20 years ago, would the discussions be different around some of the issues that were highlighted this time around?
They would be different, but I don't know if they would be any better, quite honestly. And that's because, also, 20 years ago, if you think about it, like the internet was like just an up and coming thing. People weren't even exposed to all these cultures. There might have been way more racism back then there is now, even though now, you can say there's all these other issues that you can criticize Qatar for, but as we'll maybe discuss, like some of these are actually very legitimate issues.
Right.
So let's actually look at some of these cultural criticisms, right? So you've got general women's rights and LGBT rights that are associated, simply with Muslim countries,
right?
And inherent to their religion are some of these restrictions or regulations against these practices.
But also from a legal basis, Qatar criminalizes or doesn't even recognize, let's say, the existence of LGBTQ plus peoples, right? Criminalizes sexual activity between males. It's in the legal code. Criminalizes sexual activity between females. And there is also the potential for punishment by death. Now, I don't know if this is all part of a penal code that was passed in 2004. I don't know if anybody's actually been executed for being gay, but in theory, it is written into the legal system that that can happen.
The one thing I'll point out, not to get too theoretical, but in Islam, it's not like Christianity where there is like a clean break between, like the legal world and like the kind of cultural practices. In Islam, like Islam itself provides a legal framework to work with. And has a lot to say about that. So it's not like Christianity where it's very divorced.
Well, it's divorced, but we should also underscore the fact that in American politics lately, you have had the influence of Christianity onto quote unquote Christian morality onto the legal system, such as the debate around Roe versus Wade.
Sure. And in practice, yes, Christianity also seeps into other religions in general have seeped into the legal frameworks. However, the distinction that I'm trying to make is that it is actually inherent to the theology of Islam, whereas it's not necessarily inherent to the theology of Christianity. Again, in practice, we'll still see it. But yeah, so I guess are these fair criticisms? Because we are seeing that the World Cup it's hosted in another country with its own values and standards. It's an international competition. There's no international laws saying you have to allow LGBT rights and women's
well, there are certain treaties that member states of the United Nations sign on to. Those of which I don't have specific access to.
So maybe they are.
But there's no binding international law that says that if you don't support the rights of men and women to get married, that you're somehow like a pariah state, right? I would actually wonder if Western leaning values, if you cut it up by population, are still like the majority of thought patterns in the world, right?
Probably, right? I mean, that's a very interesting question, because if you look at the population of India and China in particular, you would almost have to lean against it.
Right.
And there's what, 1.5 billion Muslims, 2 billion Christians.
Well, and actually,
so I mean,
let me ask you this question. I mean, you brought up the issue of women's rights, the rights of gays, lesbians, bisexuals, etc. in Qatar. Now, is criticizing that, if we did establish that there is like a legal code inherent to Islam, is criticizing that Islamophobia, right? Would you refer to these critiques as Islamophobic that were being issued to Qatar before and during the World Cup?
That's an interesting question. No, I think these particular criticisms aren't at all Islamophobic, because these are very basic value questions that you can, make these criticisms and evaluate them for outside of Islam. In fact, we've had the same issue here in the U.S., which is a Christian nation. But even the term Islamophobia, I mean, I think like if you want to use the term like phobia, I think maybe it's better targeted towards like Muslims than like the theology. Because I don't think, the idea of like Islamophobia, like people that are like afraid and scared of like the Islamic theology. I mean, yes, that's a thing, but it's like, I think what people maybe in practice more refer to as like Muslim phobia, which encapsulates maybe an Arab identity coupled in with certain Islamic,
interesting
theologies. I think maybe that's what it's more about. But anyhow, I mean, what about you? What are your thoughts?
I think, in essence, I think if you take it in a vacuum, those critiques probably aren't reflections of Islamophobia, right? If you just look at it on paper, somebody criticizing even something like forcing a woman to wear a headscarf, I don't think it's an expression of Islamophobia. However, I do think, back to the point about, implicitly believing what Brazil says versus Qatar, I do think there is an underlying element of this tournament happening in a Middle Eastern country. And I do think that Middle Eastern countries have a certain trigger point for places like the United States and the UK. And
Jesus always has blue eyes,
Well, I mean, yeah, big, beautiful blonde hair. Yeah. I think that all of the critiques are valid and understandable. And I think that there's no issue there. But I do think that it's important to look at also where these critiques are coming from, the history of relationships between these countries, and why they were so vociferously issued. And I do think that 9/11, particularly here in the United States, warped our thinking about the Middle East to a certain extent, where there's almost no finesse or middle ground. That aside, I am 100% in agreement that the treatment of women and LGBTQ plus in Qatar is not great.
Okay, so again, but though let's really like nail this point down. This is an international tournament in Qatar.
Yes.
Okay, we disagree with some of their practices. Like, does that justify like the level of like media scrutiny and, I guess, focus that has been kind of the focus that has been put on these issues, when, like we said, in Brazil or in another country, maybe like the focus is going to be more just on the World Cup in general as a sporting event.
But that also wasn't 100% true, because even in Brazil there was this hyper focus over, oh my gosh, like
that is true.
The stadiums are falling apart. Oh my gosh, like the residences are in poor quality. I think every international tournament, be it the Olympics or the World Cup, there's always like a media sensation around. I mean, like the Sochi Olympics in Russia, right? It was like, they put bathrooms, like toilets next to each other.
But there wasn't in Germany in the 2006 World Cup, right? And was there, the scrutiny in the 2010 World Cup in South Africa, right? There was a lot of focus on the history of South Africa with Nelson Mandela and everything that had happened with the racial segregation in that country. But there wasn't the same level of... and maybe they just didn't have as much to criticize in that particular country.
Or maybe
Germany, look... there's a lot you could criticize Germany for. So at the same time, that's also, you could also, if you're playing devil's advocate, you can say that was in the past, and what's happening now in Qatar, it's very
in the present,
again. And when you couple it with the migrant deaths, it's easy to say these are the bad guys. It's very easy now to like look and say, okay, they don't respect women, they don't have LGBT rights, they don't give a shit about the migrant workers, blah blah blah. Like, it is easy to paint them as a villain.
Well, I think it's easy to paint them as a villain also because they've been cast as the villain for the past 20 years, right? I mean,
on top of the historical context,
right? Exactly. Like
yes,
it is very easy to position them in like the image of the oppressor, because in fact they have been positioned that way in our popular culture. I mean, look at, I don't know, like video games, like who are you killing? Like, I don't play Call of Duty, but I think lately you're killing Russians. But like leading up to, I remember when I was a little kid playing Xbox or something. Yeah, like you killed some Arab dudes, right? But I think those are two conversations, right? There's the very real problematic views that the West has on the Middle East, while simultaneously you can also look at the very real problems that Qatar has with its treatment of women, migrant workers, and LGBTQ+. And I think these two things collided perfectly in the two towers of the World Cup in Qatar. Yeah, collided. That was so bad.
That was terrible.
I was hoping to get a smile out of you. These things perfectly kind of meshed together during the World Cup, in addition to the layer of a hyper awareness here at home and throughout the world, really, about the rights of LGBTQ, the rights of women. I mean, these are things that we've been talking about for like 6-7 years that happen to also fit into the news cycle when the World Cup was happening. And I think that was interesting to see, because this, we joked around about the title, like the first woke World Cup, but really it is the first woke World Cup, because this is the first World Cup that has really taken place in the post-Trump sort of really mobilized internet activist stage. That, of course, this was going to happen. I mean, there's no question about it. And it makes me wonder, if Germany hosted the World Cup next time around, maybe there would be extra scrutiny involved.
Well, the most recent one was in Russia, right?
Yeah, the previous
and so
one.
Obviously, like, the government was heavily criticized, but there wasn't a general, thankfully, there wasn't like a general disdain towards Russians.
Well, if anything, I think a lot of people, like, there was a similarly kind of a fucked up narrative that when a lot of journalists were reporting out of Russia, they're like, wow, like, who would have thought that Russia could be so great? Which is kind of like
Yes.
we expected bears and, like, to be our asses kicked by cops, but, like, everybody was actually friendly. But I don't know if I saw much of that coming out of reporting Qatar. I mean, you had, like, the typical interviews with, like, British fans and everything who, like, they don't give a shit. I mean, I guess the biggest thing they were concerned about is that, like, you can buy beer in the stadium.
Man, at one point you see the images of the tents and you're thinking Fire Festival, are they prepared? So I don't know. I think the fact that there wasn't, something didn't go wrong is like a really good thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And there wasn't to my knowledge, it wasn't a massive amount of violence or anything like that took place. I mean, for all intents and purposes, this was as peaceful of a tournament as you could have asked for. But like, leading up to it, very real problems with the migrants that died, and the migrants that had to suffer to make this tournament happen, which I suppose if that was going to be a problem, then we shouldn't have awarded it to Qatar. And then that leads to greater questions around, how does the process work at FIFA, right?
The process is very simple. And we all know exactly what that process is. So not much to add on that front. But we would like to take a moment to tell you guys to please help our channel out.
Help our platform out. Subscribe, smash that like button. Comment. Christ, we love your comments.
The algorithm loves your comments.
We love it when you tell us, first of all, how we don't understand anything because we don't sleep with real women. We love engaging with you on the beautiful comment section. So please, like, comment, subscribe. And this kind of raises also a good point about, like, international sporting competitions, right? Like, are they used to kind of soften the edges of dangerous or problematic regimes or countries? Things like, the 1936 Olympics in Nazi Germany, or the 1978 World Cup in Argentina when they had their military dictatorship. They're kind of hosted in countries that are doing very messed up things, around concentration camps, torture, extralegal detentions, oppression of certain.
Yeah, and actually, I don't know how many people know about that, but Argentina literally had their own Hitler.
Yeah.
I only recently found out and was absolutely, like, just blown away. But yeah, they essentially, use the World Cup to sport wash their country and their government.
Right. And I think this is what happens during sport and international sporting matches, where you kind of forget about the ugly side of certain societies. And maybe that's a good thing, right? Maybe that's the whole point of sport, is that you're supposed to have, like, a neutral field of competition where North Korea can play the United States, and it's sport.
Well, I think so. I think this is actually one of the best counter arguments that somebody could have for saying, yeah, we should actually host a World Cup in places like Qatar, because what happens is it opens up their culture to the world. It opens up scrutiny, right? Additional scrutiny to their culture, but also it allows for different values to start seeping into their culture. And this is how, if you think they have a backwards culture, for example, this is how they're going to evolve. If you think they're going to evolve quicker by being closed off, then I think you're probably wrong.
But that also has a lot of it leads to the question, like that arrangement. I agree with you. I think any like international exposure, you always draw in great things, right? Kind of how we got a long time ago, we brought mathematics from the Arab world into Europe because of warfare, right? Any international exposure ultimately is good. But this does lead to a question of who has the right culture, right? Who has the right set of beliefs. And objectively, I think on a secular level, the full integration of women's rights and women into society and the protection of minorities is a good thing. And I think in that sense, that's something that our civilization, which also isn't perfect, right? We're still like fucking figuring this out, but we're on the path of like trying to maintain a level of harmony in that sense in society. Mm-hmm. But I've been thinking about this a lot, but what determines or who determines what is right culture versus wrong culture? So if we're opening up Qatar and we're, civilizing it basically, like what is determined that what you're bringing in is right versus wrong?
Well, no, I mean, I think that's a really good question, and I don't think there's a simple answer to that. To just clarify the point that I had made previously, it's under the assumption that Western culture, like if you're a Westerner and you believe your values are superior, for example, which, let's be honest, most Westerners believe that. They won't say they think their values are superior, but like, let's be honest, that's exactly what you're trying to say. If you do make that assumption, then I do think, like, we had discussed, you can make a case that by having the World Cup in a place like Qatar, you can maybe expedite their culture to kind of evolve in a direction that is more favorable towards Western values.
Right.
But to answer the overarching question about like how do you know what's right? I mean this is what philosophers argue about all day, right? Like how do we determine like moral values and ethics and all this? Like it's not an easy thing to answer. I think like if people really want to think about this more, they can listen to our episode, I believe number 7, Good and Evil, where we talk about morality and ethics and values. But
I think a good thought exercise to have around this is if somebody from a conservative country, let's say Qatar, comes to the United States, and we have the expectation they will behave in accordance with our laws, right? Like we will have the expectation that they won't subjugate their women to certain practices, that they don't have to participate in, but they won't try to put an end to gay pride parades. Those are things in our culture and our society that are reflections off of certain freedoms that we have and that we've chosen to express. If we have an expectation that somebody that comes to the United States respects those things, should not there be the expectation that if we are indeed going to Qatar, we should also respect their
even if we disagree,
and it goes against our belief. See, and I don't know if I believe in that 100%, because I don't think I could like
yeah, it's a tough one. Here's what I'll say, that I think if you are so bothered by some of their values and practices, then you can boycott it. You can not go to the World Cup. But if you go there, you should go under the assumption that you have to respect their laws first and foremost, obviously, but also their culture. Can you criticize their culture? Yes, but when you're going there for the World Cup, know what you're going in there for, right? You're not going in there for political activism. You're going in there to watch this sporting spectacle, which is what it was. Now, someone can make the counter argument, well, this is the moment to really bring a spotlight on these issues. This is the moment to be politically active regarding these issues. So again, it's like, it's a very, but then again, like, you can have people that are not going to the World Cup bring spotlight on this. And if you're someone who is going there, just go there knowing you have to respect their laws and their customs.
Which maybe that's exactly what happened, because we got a spotlight on the issues, right? Mm-hmm. Here we are talking about labor abuses, and we're talking about the plight of, which I guess I don't know the specific plight of LGBTQ in Qatar. I just know
today you feel.
Today I feel gay. But yeah, so we're talking about these things. Christ, I imagine a lot of people didn't even know Qatar was a country until the tournament happened. And they started seeing people complain on social media.
I didn't know Qatar was a country until I landed in Doha. So
interesting. I didn't know Qatar was a free country. I thought it was still a colony of the United Kingdom. I didn't actually think that. But so that the awareness was raised, right? People still went to Qatar and they complained about, no alcohol, but they still went to the tournament. They played the sport. They enjoyed the sport, and they left. Maybe this was a success. But I think that there's certain uncomfortable nuances that are definitely making it difficult to host tournaments in places that aren't aligned with things that are now being seen as Western values, right? I mean, if you're an openly gay player for a certain country, you can't have your spouse there with you to support you, or your spouse has to pretend like he's not your spouse, or they are not your spouse.
It's a very good point.
And also, I mean, I don't even really think about this. From what I remember, women commentators weren't covered if they're reporting from Qatar.
I'm not sure about that.
I don't actually remember. Sure. So, I mean, I think it's...
But yeah, it does open up some very interesting issues, right? Where you have a direct conflict intrinsic to the sporting event itself.
Right. But I will say, for instance, at the Olympic Games, we are now allowing women to compete with their heads covered if they see that as an expression of their culture, right? In the West, let's say. Or, there's Iranian judokas, or I guess now, with the protests and stuff, it's a bit different. But in the previous Summer Olympics, they would compete with their heads covered. Or a Saudi weightlifter or something like that.
Well, this is interesting, because now what you're essentially alluding to is like, who is the responsible party for now kind of directing what is acceptable and what isn't, right? Like FIFA is the responsible party. And if they're going to award Qatar the World Cup, or another country in the future the World Cup, they should be able to like impose, kind of their desires for what this World Cup is going to look like. Hey, you guys have to sell beer in the stadium. You guys have to, respect LGBT rights. Like, it is up to them as the governing body to kind of take care of those issues, right? To resolve those conflicts. Of course, when your organization is so corrupt, I mean, it's probably part of the reason why there was such a huge debate. I mean, if you recall, there was a lot of issues with the armband.
Yes. Yeah, that's
where
right.
They wanted to wear like rainbow armbands, some of the captains of the respective teams. But basically what happened is FIFA, again, shilling for Qatar, said, there will be sporting sanctions imposed on you if you do so. Of course, no team's going to prepare 4 years for the World Cup, only for the rainbow-colored armband to, dock them points or whatever.
And I think this is a question of FIFA needs to have an understood standard of what are they going for.
They need to have bare minimum values, right? Like they need to have like their own sort of like ethical standards.
But even if that means we're going to accept like cultural relativism as our standard, where we will adhere to the cultural and legal norms of the country in which we're being hosted, right?
Well, no, but by virtue of having a standard, you're going to exclude some countries.
That's true,
right? So like, you can be open. Sure, their standard shouldn't be like everything in the Quran, right? So then no Muslim countries can like be a part of.
FIFA becomes a Sharia sporting organization.
But if their standard is like a few things like, hey, okay, you have to respect LGBT rights, women should be allowed to drive in your country, maybe that does disqualify the majority of Muslim countries, but like in general, the point is like, have some very like base values that you adhere to. So you don't have, and like, they should be able to sell beer in the stadium. Okay.
But okay. And I agree with everything you're saying. Let me just flip the conversation around a bit. Back to our original point over if, let's say, FIFA is a reflection off of majority view in the world, what if it's a reflection off of like the global consensus on something, right?
Okay.
What if FIFA would be issuing a standard of, hey, if we're going to host the World Cup in the United States, we will have no open expressions of LGBTQ plus solidarity. Because, in fact, the majority of the world does not believe in this. Therefore, your country should not have a sway over this or something like that. Do you get what I'm saying?
You're saying, what if FIFA said that to the U.S. in 2026?
Right.
Well, let's be straight here. The U.S. has a much bigger dick than Qatar, right?
I would say, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So FIFA, that's a very interesting question, man. I don't know.
Right.
I don't even know what to say to that. Like,
I mean, if FIFA is an international sporting organization, right? And the majority, I don't know if the majority of the world supports this or doesn't support it.
My bet is the majority of the world is probably like bigoted towards LGBT in some way. So you're probably not wrong that would be, if you're going to have a global consensus, it's probably away from LGBT rights. And if that
we have also accepted as, I think there are swaths of the population, myself included, yourself included, that see the protection of rights for LGBTQ plus and women as integral parts of our society moving forward and functioning, right? Almost non-negotiables. But that doesn't mean that it's the majority view in the United States, even. Dude,
honestly, man, I'm really trying to think about this question, and the problem is there's so many parties involved, right? Like, there's the advertisers,
right? There's the money, yeah.
There's there's going to be the organization in the U.S. that, the committee or whatever that kind of bids for the World Cup, and how they coordinate that with FIFA. And then you have, certain states might have their own expectations, right. Cities within those states. Like, it's kind of a clusterfuck. Like, I don't even know. And then like, I don't know. Like, I don't know how much like taxpayer money is impacted by some of this. Like, it's really a shit show. And if you think about it, like, it's a miracle any of this shit gets even coordinated.
Which maybe, I think the moment when it became clear that there were people like dying in vast numbers to make this tournament happen in Qatar, I think that's the point where like the plug should have been pulled. At that level, I could say that the tournament went off without a hitch. Like, it was a great tournament. Like, the games were interesting. There's drama, there was intrigue, and everybody left happy and content. Yeah, sure, but like, objectively speaking, it was still a failure because
right,
a percentage of the population suffered to make it happen.
They spent $200 billion on infrastructure,
and they built a brand new city. The question is that city going to have utility moving forward, right? Like, is what was it called? Well, is Lusail going to have a function in Qatar after?
What would karma have to say about this?
Is karma a Christian or a Muslim value?
Well, I'm asking you. What will karma say about this?
Well, I guess that was a dumb question on my part. We know where karma is a Buddhist value. I think karma favors the dollar, unfortunately, and I think that if you just because you behave atrociously doesn't mean that you're going to be punished for it.
I mean, look, I was listening to a podcast where they made a very good point about, just the level of international exposure that Qatar got from a purely business standpoint.
Yeah.
It put him on the international stage, which is priceless, regardless of what happens to, the new city that they built, regardless of what happens to these stadiums, some of which they're going to tear down, if I understand correctly. But yeah, I don't know. It's crazy. Now, to go back to the 2026 World Cup, which will be in the States, let's think about, from a Qatari standpoint, what criticisms do you expect, the Qatari government to launch from a marketing standpoint?
Right. I mean, they do. Okay, so we laugh, but they do control like all of Al Jazeera, which is a pretty major news outlet.
They also control beIN, I don't know, it's like beIN Sport Group or something, which has huge reach in terms of like sports broadcasting.
How ballsy would it be if Qatar just issued a mass press campaign over the mistreatment of blacks in America in advance of the 26 World Cup?
Let me ask you this. Let me counter this by saying, do they even need to when there's like plenty of woke people broadcasting for them?
But no, this is the question. Is there going to be a similar international scrutiny applied to the United States? We're going to have plenty of like homegrown discussions on it because I think that, it's a major part of our narrative right now. But are we going to have like international media outlets doing like long form exposés over the treatment of black people in the United States?
I would expect media in Russia and Qatar and like these other, Iran, I would expect them to be very harsh towards the U.S.
That is true.
Whether, in Europe there's going to be a great deal of discussion, probably not, is my guess.
But maybe this is like the great compromise we're coming to, is that if you're hosting an international tournament of any sorts, be it the Olympics or the World Cup, and there's massive amounts of like media attention, maybe that gives everybody a blank check to talk shit on your abuses. It's like, yeah, okay, Germany, you're gonna host the World Cup. Everybody's got free reign to like criticize the shit of you for like the Holocaust and like Nazi stuff. And really, maybe the 2026 World Cup is a great opportunity for additional scrutiny on the very real shortcomings of our society here in the United States. When is the last time we got to check in on how Native Americans are doing? The quality of healthcare on Native reservations.
Well, that's basically the point that was made, in favor of like, Qatar hosting the World Cup, is it does give them that same opportunity to reflect on their own society.
That is true.
Right? So yes, it should, in principle, it's the same thing. It should allow us to reflect on our society. Although obviously the U.S. is, due to the political tension and the tribalism, like maybe we're more aware of our, at least in terms of modern day issues, some of the modern day issues, obviously from a historical context, a lot of people still lack that understanding in terms of, imperialism and in terms of slavery and like in terms of a lot of issues. What we did to the Japanese,
and what we still do to a huge percentage of the population in prison.
Yeah,
right? Yeah. Okay, we have an awareness of them, but is that going to be a factor coming into play when, or was that even a point of discussion when the World Cup was awarded to the United States? I don't think so.
Yeah, no one mentioned that.
And I think ultimately speaking, this comes down to like, well, because it's the fucking United States and you don't criticize it, right? Or maybe you criticize it openly, but you're not going to like go and like prohibit it from hosting like a international sport tournament. I'm looking forward to like North Korean news agency like sending a reporter out to like the Cherokee and be like, tell us about your.
Would they allow North Korean reporters? Is there any like restriction on that? There shouldn't be. They should allow
freedom of the press, man.
It would be awesome.
Yeah,
but I would be astonished if they don't like
the North Korean
abandon their country and just stay here.
No, like North Korean Vice News. It's like a Gen Z publication from Pyongyang.
That's real?
No, I'm saying I'm joking. I mean, it would be.
You're joking.
Yeah, I would pay money for that. I would sponsor that.
The problem is like they would all just leave the country. Like there's just, of course, risk having their entire families murdered.
Sure, but yeah. No, the 26 World Cup, I think if there is any like level of hypocrisy coming from the West, I think it's going to really come to the surface in that particular tournament, right? Because we have all the evidence for how we discuss Qatar, and then we can use that as a reference point for how we discuss the United States and the build up to it, right? And I'd be curious if they're going to count how many people died in like building the stadiums.
So 3.5 years from now,
we're going to meet.
We are going to do another podcast on the 2026 World Cup
now, and we're gonna splice in things that we said right now.
Even if it's the 19th episode of the podcast.
Yes, we will make it the special number 19. But do you think there's a level of hypocrisy in general when we?
Well, yes, of course there is. Yeah, Westerners criticizing, Qatar, and then there's going to be criticism of, Qataris criticizing the West when the U.S. hosted, I'm sure. There's criticism, but the important thing to understand is, like, just because someone's a hypocrite doesn't mean they're wrong. Like, just because you're a hypocrite, you could be the biggest fucking hypocrite on the planet, but your criticism can be 100% valid.
That is true. You just don't take criticism well yourself.
Yes.
It doesn't mean your point's wrong, but it also means...
Or you're oblivious to, your shortcomings.
Because if we do take the top three issues that really were levied against Qatar, the treatment of migrant workers, the treatment of women, and the treatment of LGBTQ+, the track record is not that great in the United States either, right? I mean...
How many people died during, the construction of, like, the Empire State Building?
Right.
How many people died... Well, this isn't in the U.S., but in the Panama Canal.
Which the U.S. built.
Right. Which for its obviously huge economic benefit. But
right. How many people die on a regular basis? How many migrant workers are making American companies money picking fruit in the Southwest without appropriate documentation, without health care, without any sort of like legal protections?
How many migrant workers are getting shipped to Kamala Harris's house?
Oh, shit. Yeah. Yeah, that was fucked, man. Also with...
Imagine if that happened in Qatar, where you had, migrant workers from Nepal and India and Pakistan shipped to, like...
Some prince's, like, front door or something.
Yeah.
Chic or... We don't know shit about Qatar, man. This is like... That is bad.
The Emir.
Yeah, so... And again, the track record with women's rights, especially right now... isn't so great. It's actually quite terrible. Women's mortality rates in this country are like on par. No offense to Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso might be a great place, right? But Burkina Faso is not the world's premier superpower on paper. Our mothers should not be dying into childbirth the rate that they are. To say nothing for the challenges that our LGBTQ plus communities face. The fact that, we've guaranteed protections to same-sex marriage, but those in theory could always be at risk of being revoked depending on like the political winds that shift in this country. Like,
true. Yeah.
And part of me does think this like hyper focus and criticism of Qatar's handling of preparing for and hosting the World Cup is a way to kind of like push off the hyper focus on these issues here at home, where it's like, oh well, I mean, look at shit in Doha, it's so bad over there. Don't look at like what's going on here in the US, right? But we'll see. But I do think, like, to me, I think your point is very valid. Like, the hypocrisy can exist independent of the legitimacy of the criticisms issued. So I think simultaneously the West is correct in a lot of points that were levied against Qatar, but oh my gosh, are these problems ever persistent in our own societies as well? And I hope everybody takes time to dig into them and study them intricately.
Well said. Now, this maybe all of this discussion begs the question: should we have international tournaments at all?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a question that eventually we're going to have to start asking ourselves, because I mean, these tournaments are freaking expensive. You have to basically build out infrastructure from ground up. I mean, what country has like, I mean, barring like, Argentina or Brazil, but like how many countries have like 6 state-of-the-art soccer/football stadiums just like ready to go, right? I mean, that's not even saying like the Olympics. How many places have bobsled tracks?
Well, it's a good point, actually. Just to interject, like we are seeing now, like these future bids, even with the U.S. World Cup, even though the U.S. could host it itself, it's actually Mexico, U.S. and Canada,
Yeah.
and these other bids that are happening now, like there's talk of like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Greece. There's talk of like I don't know, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay or something. Like so you are starting to see this because it is. Maybe it's the inflation's really bad, but like these countries are like shit. Like actually it'd be a little bit easier to just host it between a few of us instead of
But there's also
billions of dollars.
I read in an article this notion that the more expensive and complex the bureaucracy is to host these tournaments, the more likely you're going to lean on authoritarian regimes to host them. Because in authoritarian regime, you could just throw bodies at it, and it's a lot easier to pull off like a mass scale tournament. Less red tape, but yeah, I mean, I think that if we look at like the spirit of these tournaments, I think that is an important thing too, right? This like coming together of nations to set aside their political and cultural differences and compete with one another. I mean, I think those things are very important. And if we just got rid of the Olympics and got rid of the World Cup, it would be a shame to a certain extent, because I don't know if we have many moments on like a global scale where we are able to see the national team of Qatar play against another team in soccer, right? Which I remember when I was a kid, like to me that was such an eye-opening experience where you got to see different cultures and like how they would cheer and chant for their respective teams. I mean, that's all a very important thing.
Yeah. No, I mean, for me, it's two things, to kind of answer this question about the international tournaments. It's, first of all, like, you're not going to stop them. Like in practice, they won't stop because there's just too much support for them. And secondly, yeah, I mean, I do think they should take place simply because of, the element that you mentioned, the spirit and the atmosphere and the actual tribalism in this context, I actually think is a very good thing, because I think obviously humans are very tribal and we don't have wars as often as we did in the past. This is kind of a good proxy, almost.
Blow-off valve, yeah.
Yeah, so like it's good to see these countries going up against each other, right? In the Olympics, in the World Cup. It's good for national pride. It's good for social cohesion within these countries. And most importantly, for people that might be suffering, for people that are not maybe enjoying their life in the way that maybe people in other countries are. Like, in Argentina, the inflation's really bad now. This victory couldn't have come at a better time for their spirit.
That's right.
And even for myself as just a big soccer fan, who's someone who has been a big fan of Messi, watching him, when I was younger and growing up with him, like it feels good. Like you kind of get on a little bit of a high when, your sports hero wins, and like I mean, how do you put a price on joy, right? Like how
much is Messi worth?
Like financially? Like
yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's like
whatever that is, that is the price of joy.
I mean, his net worth is probably, I would say probably close to $1 billion at this point, but
there you go.
His actual like scope and reach is probably within the billions.
Yeah. So there it is.
So that's what it is.
That's your price.
Well, then that's another question. Like, are like athletes actually valued correctly because of what they bring? Right.
Right.
Like, because we think about how much athletes get paid for what they do. Oh, they're just kicking a ball around.
Well,
actually,
do you change how much the athletes from Morocco are paid when they start doing very well and they add like drama and like attention to the tournament. Because if this is just like a run of the mill tournament and the same like 5 teams are like advancing,
well, they do end up getting paid better if club teams start to like pluck them out. Like, oh, you had a good performance in the World Cup. It is a way for some of these players to showcase their talents. So if you do make a good run, chances are you've got players on your team playing very well. Further chances are they will get picked up by bigger teams, hence they will get paid more. So that does get reflected actually from a financial standpoint.
Well, so okay, I think both of us probably agree that it would be a terrible shame to cancel international competitions, but we recognize the fact that they're pretty damn bad for the environment. They're pretty damn bad for, let's say, social stability at times within the countries that are hosting them. They're tremendously expensive. But if we're going to keep them, I think they're probably going to need to evolve and be reformed somehow. So do you have any thoughts on maybe what could be done to improve things like the World Cup?
Well, yeah. Let's focus on the World Cup. Because FIFA are easy targets because the level of corruption is just unbelievable. Like they are quite possibly the most corrupt organization of any comparable scale, right? Like they are just like, if you haven't seen the Netflix documentary FIFA Uncovered, 5-part series, I think, brilliant, and in a sense shocking, in a sense not that shocking. Like it's just. It really is it's mind-boggling. Like they would bribe some of these some of these FIFA officials with literally like suitcases of money outside their hotel rooms.
Damn.
Like it's almost comical, like how it was done. But I think the first step really is we have to figure out as a global society, like, how do we actually govern and regulate international organizations?
Right.
Like, I don't know about the Olympics. I mean, are they like, is it an international
Olympic Committee?
Yeah. So like, how do we actually regulate them?
How do we hold them accountable?
Right.
If they do mess up. Yeah.
So that's one. Two is like, yes, I think we should be, the host countries should be places where you don't need to build an entire city.
Yeah.
Support the event. You don't need to build 10 stadiums.
But at the same time, that's going to limit who can actually host it, right? I mean,
of course.
If we're I think you had a very valid point about a lot of these tournaments bringing attention and interest into certain countries. We would want places like Burkina Faso or I don't know, the Kingdom of Tonga to host these sorts of things. So maybe there should be a way that.
Well, multiple countries hosting it is the way, right? Like,
right.
So if you have, I mean, pick some countries in, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos.
Yeah. That's actually
like, how many stadiums do they have between them? Probably, I don't know. I guess you need like 8 stadiums or so to host a World Cup. I don't know if they have 8 big stadiums. Maybe they can build 1 or 2. Okay, if they build 1 or 2, is it a big deal? That's okay, right? If the World Cup is if they know 10 years, in advance that they're going to be hosting the World Cup, I think it's okay.
But also, do we need to have these massive stadiums, right? Do we need to have these like tremendous feats of architecture? Because I mean, if you look at World Cups from like.
Well, that's like asking, do people have to be greedy? Well, they are. Well, like FIFA officials are greedy.
They want their glitzy, glamorous shit. Yeah.
But no, I'm with you. Like, do we need a stadium that has 80,000, that it has an 80,000 person capacity when, at least, when you're watching it on TV and when you're probably playing, like 40,000 probably would do it.
Right.
Know? From an atmosphere standpoint,
right? And I think that's actually one of the best things that could be done is to really encourage like shared hosting, because that also that maximizes the positives. Because then you start thinking
and it's also multiple countries, multiple cultures, as opposed to
a single. Yeah, exactly. And
criticism can be spread out.
Right. Yeah, we're not just going to be. Honestly, man, why the fuck aren't we digging into the shit Canada's doing? I feel like Canada's a scary country. Like,
maybe we'll have a chance.
Yeah.
Maybe if no one else does, we will on the 2026 episode. We will.
Everybody's always like, oh, Canada's all so friendly, maple syrup, dude. Anytime those like investigations come out and they just find a bunch of like mass graves behind like schools, it's like, yeah, we just exterminated an entire population. I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. That checks out. So maybe we're gonna find out.
And don't think Mexico's clear here too. Like they're run by drug cartels. We're gonna have a field day with Mexico.
Oh my gosh, like I can't even imagine what like cartel influence over international
they get, like,
soccer.
Half the profits from like the World Cup games.
Oh jeez, they're hosting like, oh god.
There's gonna be like campaigns against like you cannot sell Coke at the World Cup games.
Or in fact, you must sell Coke. You must buy cocaine. So yeah, co-hosting I think is great because it also spreads out the financial responsibility for it. I think maybe the very first thing is definitely reforming the international organization, and after that, I think you can start applying like sustainable building standards. Right? You only use like some kinds of cement, or basically finding ways to ensure that this isn't as much of like a toxic dumpster fire as it is right now. But yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of hope in these things, and I think it's good to, when people get excited about these tournaments, and it's good to see people get interested in the sport and interested in other countries. And I think my favorite thing, be it the Olympics or the World Cup, is you always get clips of like drunk fans just like hugging on each other. It's like some like fat dude from like Surrey is just like making out with a chick from like Argentina. It's just, that warms my heart,
Or the cameramen identifying certain people in the stands.
Yes. Yeah, very sexy men with great rippling muscles.
Exactly.
So hopefully we can change things around, make it better.
Yeah, there's definitely a positive spin we can put on these from every angle, right? And so let's hope things move in that direction. But if not, we will be here to criticize
2026, baby.
But that's why we also need you guys to subscribe, to hit the like button, to leave comments, and share this among your friends,
your peer groups,
even your foes,
your family.
Today you feel like a Radius of Reason host.
Happy New Year, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.
Adios.